All right, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. Before we begin, I think it would only be appropriate for us to start off with a chapter of Tehillim, a chapter of Psalms, a prayer to God to bring peace to this world, to protect our brothers and sisters fighting on the front lines, and to put an end to all sorrow, pain, and suffering. So if you'll join me on the screen, you have it in Hebrew and in English for those that can see. This is Psalms chapter 121. Shir lamalis esayinai eleharim me'ayin yava yezri ezri me'im adinoi oisei shemayim varetz al yitain lamoit raglecha yanum shemrecha hine la yanum v'la yishan shemer Yisrael adinoi shemrecha adinoi tzilcha al yad yiminecha yaimam hashemesh lo yakeka v'yareach baloila Adonai yishmarcha mikol ra yishmar es nafshecha Adonai yishmar tzeischa v'yecha me'ata v'yad olam. All right. Well, we're here tonight for the Talmud on trial, and that would be answering centuries of accusations against the Talmud, specifically anti-Semitic ones. And we don't have to look so far back. You go back to Berlin in the 1930s and the burning of the books. You have the modern day attacks on social media. And time again, over the past few years, I've been seeing them in a lot of places. Now, in truth, I wouldn't even bother addressing them in any way, shape, or form for one very simple reason. Without even getting technical, without even getting complicated, without even getting to the core of the idea, it doesn't even deserve a response for the very simple reason. Can you imagine if somebody walked into a, not necessarily on campus, but a place where academia is studied, or, walked into Einstein's lecture, and somebody took offense to something who never studied science, never studied physics, and all of a sudden they're taking offense and having an opinion on something that Einstein is saying in the realm of physics. You wouldn't even dignify that person by giving them a response. So if somebody hasn't studied and combed through the Talmud backwards and forwards to truly understand it, its origins and its purpose, they deserve no response. That's number one. Number two, in general, when it comes to antisemitism, the answer to antisemitism is generally not going to be with responding to their questions. If somebody's asking a question out of curiosity, out of wanting to learn, out of wanting to study, then you respond. But if somebody is just looking to attack, the moment you answer one question, they're already moving on to the next question because it was never about the question. It was always about the attack. So what then is the proper response to anti-Semitism? So we're just coming fresh off the holiday of Purim. In the holiday of Purim, we find how Haman, right, 2,500 years ago, he comes to Achashverosh with an attack against the Jewish people. An anti-Semitic smear in the beginning of the Megillah scroll, in the beginning of the Megillah Esther. It talks about where Haman says there's a nation, they're different, they act weird, they don't keep our holidays, they're always doing their own thing. Why don't we destroy them? The final solution. And Achashverosh says, okay, sure. Long story short, he ends up marrying a Jewess, Esther. She becomes queen. After 5 years of him not knowing that she's Jewish, she finally says to him, when are you going to save me and my nation? He says, what nation is that? She says, the Jewish people. He says, oh, okay. And boom, right then and there, the lead anti-Semite, Haman, gets hanged. Now, why doesn't she answer the accusations? Why doesn't she respond and say, even though we're different, we're still good people. Even though we're this, we're still that. We don't find that anywhere. All she says is, I'm Jewish. Because the greatest response to anti-Semitism is to be a Jew loud and proud. To show up with your Judaism, and they themselves will see, if they're not looking to attack, they will look and discover that there's something beautiful about the Jew no matter what. If they're looking to hate, no matter what you say is going to help, they're just going to turn that hate back against you. And the third reason why we're having the discussion tonight is because, unfortunately, over the past few years, many Jews have turned to me with these questions that they're getting from non-Jews or seeing on social media. But you know what's happening? They're turning to me and say, I don't even know the answer to these questions. These are Jews with Q's. These are Jewish people with questions. And for us ourselves, we have to educate ourselves. Educate ourselves, educate our children, educate our communities, because we should know how beautiful our tradition is. And that in itself is one of the greatest responses, because the greatest response to anti-Semitism is just educating us, educating the Jewish people, and that in itself will drive away a lot of the hate. So that's what we're here to do tonight. And the question is as follows. Before we can, and one more reason why we're doing it, and that is I want to give a shout out to the brave men and women that for the past 6 weeks, 20 men and women spent 6 weeks with me. We had a course together studying the Talmud, decoding the Talmud, understanding its history, its origins, where it's coming from, what its purpose is, how it works, the rules that it goes by. And in their honor, I'd like to dedicate tonight's class. So just a quick recap before we sink our teeth into it, and that is, what exactly is the Talmud? You see, you have on your source sheets, everybody's got one of these. So you'll see the first one just gives you a brief, facts and history of it, and that is, the Mishnah is a basic recording of all the laws of Judaism. It was compiled roughly 200 of the Common Era in Hebrew, approximately 120 sages quoted throughout the Mishnah. The Gemara expands on and analyzes and discusses everything said in the Mishnah. Its language is mostly in Aramaic. Approximately 800 different sages are quoted. When we use the term Talmud, we're referring to a combination of Mishnah and Gemara, 63 tractates. There are 2 Talmuds, one known as the Jerusalem Talmud, which is closed in the 4th century, the Babylonian Talmud, which is completed in the 5th century. Jerusalem Talmud was not actually in Jerusalem, was actually in Tiberias. That's for another time. The standard print of the Babylonian Talmud has 5,422 pages, approximately 2 million words. Now, what does it talk about? What does it do? So about 3/4 of it is basically Jewish law, ethics, and tradition. How to live life as a Jew. 1/4 of it, and by the way, within the law, we're talking about both civil and religious. In Judaism, there's no such thing as civil law and religious law. They all fall under one category. Now, the last 1/4 of it basically discusses history of both Judaism and the world around it at the time, philosophy, and theology of Judaism. And that comprises the entirety of the Talmud. But then the question then is that it? Is there nothing more to the Talmud than that? Because you see, there's something unique about the Talmud, and that is to the Jewish people. It has been held high and up front and center as a part of Judaism for the past 1,800 years. It lies at the core of Judaism. And the question is, what's so special and unique about it? And what are our enemies after? What are they trying to ban and burn, as we'll see in a moment? So the truth is, what the Talmud is, it's more than just a book. It's who we are as a people. As Rabbi Sadia Gaon, a great sage from the 9th century, writes, he says, Israel is our homeland, it's our motherland. The Talmud is our fatherland because it travels with us wherever we go. And that is just like you can't have a people without a land, you also can't have a Jewish people without its Torah, in this case the Talmud. And the Talmud has kept us wherever we went, whichever land we were in, throughout all the years of our exile, over the past 1,800 years or 1,500 years since the close of the Talmud. Actually, in the bottom right corner, there's one of the oldest handwritten copies of the Talmud from the 1300s. Most of the other Talmuds are printed, which came along later on in the late 1400s, early 1500s, as we'll see in a moment. Now, the Talmud is unique in the sense that so many people have banned it or tried to ban it. They've done public burnings, and that's what we're here to see now. There's nothing new about the anti-Semitic attacks on the Talmud. This has been part of our history. The first and most famous starts in 1240, but that's when we come to the most famous one, which is the burning of the Talmud, which took place in Paris either 1242 or 1244. I'll leave that for the historians, not for now, but I definitely know it was Friday, Shabbos Parshas Chukas. And many people used to fast every Friday Parshas Chukas because that's when the Talmud was burnt. Not just any Talmud. It's not like it took wagons. They actually took 24 wagons filled, not with printed books, handwritten manuscripts of the Talmud, and publicly burnt them. Moving along, in Barcelona, there was a ban and a burning. In the south of Italy, at the same time, Tortosa, Basel, Rome, Italy, Poland, and non-stop, time after time, either public burnings or bannings. And in the case where there was something in between, they said you can print it, but we have to look it over first, and we're going to tell you what to leave in and what to take out. What's fascinating is that historically we were always able to keep some kind of records of what was being taken out or what was changed. And thank God today in your standard print, it's all there, it's all clear, and there's nothing to hide behind. We're not embarrassed about any of it. Now, most of the anti-Semitic attacks that you're going to find on the Talmud, before we even get into it, and that is, number one, there's a good chance that it's misquoted. Number two, it probably doesn't even exist. And number three, if it does, it's probably certainly out of context. And what I'm going to do tonight is walk you through that and show you. What we're going to base tonight's journey on is the burning of the Talmud in 1242. And that is because what happened was, there was a Jew. His name was Nicholas Dunnan. Nicholas Dunnan was a Jew who unfortunately gave up on his Judaism, or at least the oral tradition, the rabbinic tradition of Judaism, going back way more than 2,000 years, because as we know, the oral tradition goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses himself. He gave up on all of that and decided that he was done with the Jewish community. But because when he decided he was done with the Jewish community said, we're done with you as well. So for about 15 years, he went around peddling lies and falsehoods about the Jewish community in Paris, in France. And he's looking for a way to get back. He finally made it to a meeting with the Pope. And he sat down with the Pope and he decided to expose the Talmud to the Pope. And he tells the Pope, you see, there are a lot of problems with the Jews, because, listen, it's not like the Jews and Christians were buddy-buddy until that point. But until that point, almost all the debates between the Jews and the Christians were based on Bible interpretation. And those were the debates. This is the first time in history that the Talmud comes into play in regards to a debate. He tells the Pope, you got to get rid of the Talmud. So the Pope says, all right. Pope pulls out his notes, his letters, and he sends letters to all the kings of Europe at the time. And he says, we have to do a deep dive into the Talmud, and we have to get rid of it, because there's something wrong with the Talmud. It's poisonous. It's bad for Christian society. So, guess what? Most kings officially that were Christian, but they didn't really like the Pope that much. So they didn't listen. But there was one king who did. And his name was Louis. King Louis, who St. Louis is actually named after him, right? You know, the city St. Louis. He decides that he's going to listen to the Pope because he's very, not just religious, but he's given over to the Pope. And he decides that he's going to do a deep dive into the Talmud, and he's going to have the Talmud debated in his court. But he himself is not going to reside over the debates. He's going to have his mother, I think her name was Blanche. So she's the one who's going to reside, and she's going to be the judge of what takes place. Now, a lot of this information is not from Jewish sources, from non-Jewish sources. They're not embarrassed about it. This is in the Church Chronicles. You can go and find it yourself. It's online. It's all there. The actual debate is both recorded in Latin and in Hebrew. There are some variations between the two, and granted, the Hebrew one was recorded post-debate and in a way that it could be used again in the future because they knew this was the first time, but definitely not the last time. Unfortunately, even though it seems to be that the debate was won, we'll discuss in a minute who was the Jew debating, but they decided to burn the Talmud anyways. As we know, the rest is history. And it becomes one of the saddest days on the Jewish calendar for a long time, to the point that on Tisha B'Av, the saddest day of the year, all of the sad poems that we read and the lamentations that we read are about the destruction of the first temple, the second temple, or the breaking of, the story with the spies, some even about the Inquisition. But there's one that is dedicated to the burning of the Talmud, because that in itself was seen as something catastrophic in our history. Now, who would be the one to debate? The main debater is known as Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. He was known as one of the Tosafists. He was a great-great-grandson or so of Rashi, the great French commentator. And there were many other rabbis who backed him up with a lot of the ideas, but he was the face of the argument. What we're going to do now, because when you take a look at it, there are a lot of different points that he makes. I'm going to draw from the argument that he had to defend, how he defended it, and then find another classic, modern day, which falls into that category. And as we do that, we'll go through each one, and I'll give you a few examples of what the attack was, what the rebuttal was, what the defense was, and you'll decide for yourself. All right, any questions or comments before we jump into it? Okay, so let's start it. When you look at all the attacks that there are in the Talmud, they can be broken down into 4 categories. And that is category number 1, they take an issue with Jewish law, saying that Jewish law is illogical. Illogical at best, by the way. Number 2, with the religious statements in the Talmud about other people or other religions. Number 3, about the morality of the Jews, how they treat those who are not Jewish. And number 4, that when you read through the Talmud, sometimes you can come across something which seems pretty nonsensical. Now, if you're reading a book which is dedicated to law and you turn to a page and all of a sudden there's comics in the middle of it, you say, this stuff's garbage. And that's essentially what their question is, and how can you have these beliefs, or how can you believe that how can you say these statements, and therefore the whole thing must be banned. And seemingly, if in any of these areas were to fail, the Pope and King Louis would eventually say, out with the Talmud or out with the Jews. It's interesting, actually, when they came to the conclusion, they said, the Jews are not at fault, the Talmud is at fault, right? Because the Talmud did it, not the Jews. Anyways, so example number 1. So you have this in your source sheet, and this is source number 1, and that is, the Torah describes that during certain types of idol worship, or really any type of idol worship, if a person serves an idol, they will be punishable by death by the Jewish court. Now, there is a particular idol called the Molech idol. This is mentioned in the Bible itself. What exactly was the Molech? According to most opinions, a father took his son and he passed him through a fire to the priest of the Molech. Some say that the child actually got burnt. Some say the child didn't get burnt, but that's not so relevant for our conversation right now. So the Talmud says as follows, based on the verse, that any father, let's say if a man has 5 sons, if he passes one son, the second, the third, and the fourth, up to 4 sons, passes through the fire to the priest, then the Jewish court can put this man to death. But if he takes all of his sons, all 5 of them, and passes them through, there is no death penalty by the court, because the verse says, Mizaracha lamelech, which means from your children to the Molech, which means only if you give some of your children to the Molech, but not all of your children. So if you give all the children, there's no death penalty. If you give 90% of them, then there is a death penalty. So they say, what kind of stupidity is this? If there's a problem with pagan idolatry, so why is it that a father who gives all his children is not punishable, but the father who gives some of his children is punishable? Right? Sounds pretty illogical. This is stupidity. So over here comes a huge, and one of the reasons why I wanted to use this example, and one, it's just beautiful the way he answers it, but number 2, it also gives us a beautiful insight and foundation into a lot of Jewish concepts, what I'm going to try to do tonight. And that is, he says, you guys are missing the point. When you look through the Torah, through the Bible, and you see any form of punishment that the Bible is administering, it is not civil or punitive. When it comes to the punishments described in the Torah, they are 100% about atonement. And that is somebody who commits a sin, this is the atonement process for this individual. That's what the Torah is describing. So when the Torah says this person gets the death penalty, and yeah, it has to come along, by the way, it's not just that they get the death penalty. There had to have been witnesses, 2 witnesses, he had to have been warned beforehand, he had to accept the warning, know the consequences, and nevertheless gone through it. But such a person who commits the crime gets the punishment described in the Torah. But the punishment described in the Torah has nothing to do with civil law, has nothing to do with controlling people who are committing crimes or doing things wrong. It's 100% what God is saying in order to atone for this individual. Which means a person who's willing to give one of their children to an idol, okay, it's wrong, it's offensive to God, and therefore the only atonement that can be is death by the court. However, but somebody who's so far gone that is willing to give up all of his sons to the idol, such a person doesn't deserve even atonement. And that's what it means. It doesn't mean that there's no death penalty because we're not going to punish this person, or that we're not going to take care of this person from a societal perspective. The Torah is not concerned with that. When the Torah is describing the death penalty, it's referring to atonement. You want to discuss what would happen from the civil perspective? There are other laws of how the Jewish court works when it comes to controlling a society that has gone off its way. There are other laws how the Jewish court will use in order to stop somebody from committing a crime, or somebody who has committed a crime but doesn't deserve atonement. For example, when you look in the Torah, you almost never find prison. There's only a case where there's once an imprisonment, and that is when Moses didn't know what the punishment for the individual was. Number one, why didn't Moses know what the punishment was? The person cursed God. The Torah says if you curse your parents, God forbid, a person would get the death penalty. So why would cursing God not incur a death penalty? Says the Talmud, says one of the commentators, this is exactly what it's telling us. Moses thought that somebody who cursed God could not attain atonement. So he says, I don't know what to do with the guy. And God says, give him the death penalty, even that person gets an atonement. But if we have somebody committing a crime, we put them in prison. We can do things to stop them. There are even scenarios where the Jewish court is allowed to administer capital punishment not based on one of these guidelines. Because that type of capital punishment, or that kind of punishment or penalty from the court, has nothing to do with the atonement that we're talking about, which is a phenomenal foundation in Judaism in general, and how to see that from that perspective. And with that, he says, that's exactly what the Talmud here is telling us. The Talmud here is not discussing civil law in the court. The Talmud is discussing the concept of atonement. And actually in the record of it, says that the priests in the room and the queen were all very much impressed with that answer, and they very much did accept that. Because it puts a lot of different things into context when you can look at it from a broader picture, which I'm actually going to touch upon right now, which is the modern idea, one of the modern attacks on the Talmud from the antisemites. Now, a lot of truth is, it's not just the antisemites, a lot of Jews who study this have a difficult time understanding it, but it comes from not understanding it properly. And that is in source number 2. Now, if you're going to look at the English translation, please try to hold back from reading the words that are not in bold, because the words that are in bold are based on interpretation. But read it as if you were somebody who never understood it or doesn't have that interpretation there. Just read the bold words, because that's little translation. Amar Rava said, Hachi Kamar, this is what it means to say. Gadol haba aktana, which means an adult man who engaged in intercourse with a minor girl. V'loi klum, it's nothing. Less than is tantamount to poking a finger into the eye. You read this and you say, what in the world is going on here? Can we really say that? How does the Talmud get away with making that statement? How are you going to explain that to somebody who picks up a Talmud? How are you going to explain it to yourself? What does that mean? So once again, context. You have to know what we're talking about, and we have to know what it is we're trying to accomplish. In this particular statement, right before this, the Talmud is actually discussing the marriage document between a man and a woman. Now, the marriage document between a man and a woman goes back over 2,000 years. Now, this is talking about the Jewish marriage document. I don't think there were any documents otherwise other than slave documents between husband and wife 2,000 years ago, but I could be wrong. But I know one thing for sure. The marriage document between a husband and wife in Judaism is one of those beautiful things. You know the term that I'd give you the shirt off my back? It comes from this document. Till today, we still write it, we still read it. It's in Aramaic in the original form that it was written 2,000 years ago in the most beautiful of ways. But the Talmud discusses that there's a difference between the document between a man and a virgin wife and a man and a non-virgin wife. So in this discussion that comes up, and there's one more thing you have to appreciate about the Talmud. In coding, there's a concept, I think it's called case edging, right? Edge casing. And that is, whenever a programmer is going to write a certain program, you know how like you use your phone and anything that's working on your phone, so it was written by a coder. I think we have a few in the room, so if I get anything wrong, you'll correct me, right? Right now, the fact that you're seeing that, whatever I did on my computer, etc. Somebody who writes code also has to know that this program or this app that they're writing, you need to have to make sure that all of the anomalies are also tested. You can't just test for regular use and hope that it's going to work. You have to be able to push it to all of its boundaries, because until you push it to all of its boundaries, you have no idea how and when it will fail you. Now, it might be simple for something like a PowerPoint, but imagine your banking app that has all your millions of dollars at the touch of your finger. If the wrong person finds the weakness, they have access to all your money. So the person writing that program has an entire team who are pressing on all the boundaries, testing all the edges to make sure that there's nothing faulty about it. Otherwise, the wrong person's going to come along and you've got nothing left. So the same thing is, anytime the Talmud makes a statement in Jewish law, the rabbi sitting there pushed it to all its boundaries and edges, even in far off imaginative cases that could and would never happen, but for the purpose of creating the boundaries and actually figuring out where does it start and where does it end. What are the true parameters here? Okay, so the Talmud is discussing the document between a virgin wife and a non-virgin wife. So the Talmud discusses the definition of that. And what the Talmud is making the statement over here is that a woman who had intercourse or some kind of penetration above 3 years old, the hymen is perforated and doesn't heal. But under 3 years old, the rabbis understood that the hymen could be healed, and therefore, if something, God forbid, happened to a girl, whether it was because she fell or, God forbid, if somebody abused her, under 3 years old, the hymen would repair itself. And therefore, on that girl's marriage document, it would still be considered as a virgin. Versus if it was above 3 years old, that would change the marriage document, and that would now be as a non-virgin as opposed to a virgin. That's what that statement is saying. It has nothing to do with that this is not abuse or that this is acceptable and okay, because on the contrary, you read a few different other passages in the Gemara and you realize that when it comes to people who do commit abuse, people who do take advantage of others, they can pay with it with their life, castration, fines, imprisonment, penalties. These are all there. But if you're looking in one spot and you have the wrong context, you're not going to get it. It's like reading a real estate document and being like, hey, how come there's nothing about, some other law that has nothing to do with real estate? Because we say, buddy, we're not discussing every law in that one sentence. We're discussing this very simple idea. So when you read this out of context and you quote it, it sounds ridiculous. But all of a sudden you put it into context and you say, 1 second, that actually makes sense. Because scientifically, first of all, it also works. And you see the studies that have been put out recently about this. But all of a sudden, it just changes the way we look at it. So now regarding that attack, it holds no water once you actually look at it, once you actually look at the source, once you actually figure out what's going on. Okay, any questions before we move on to the next subject? Okay, and by the way, again, for each one of these subjects, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of examples, but I want to let everybody go home at a normal time tonight or this week, so we're going to keep it to short examples for each one. Okay.
I don't understand why was this brought up in the Paris? What was the point of the prosecutor or whatever of using this?
So the prosecutor's point of using it was that if Jewish law is ridiculous, then let's get rid of the Talmud. It doesn't work in a Christian society. Okay, number 2, and that is the religious attacks. And we're going to keep this one short, but basically the prosecutor brings up that in the Talmud Gittin, it talks about a great Roman fellow. His name was Onkelos. Onkelos was the nephew of Titus. Now, this is after Titus had passed away, and Onkelos is going on an exploration, and he's rebelling, and he wants to convert to Judaism. And during his conversion to Judaism, during that process that he's deciding whether he should convert or not, it says he has a moment where he sees in a dream, he sees his uncle Titus, who already passed away, and he says, what are you doing nowadays? He says, I'm suffering in hell because of all of the harm that I brought upon the Jewish people. It says he continues down that path and he sees Balaam, that prophet who tries to curse the Jewish people in the desert. And he sees Balaam, he says, what are you doing nowadays? He says, I'm suffering in hell. Do not mess with the Jewish people. He says, should I convert to them? He says, sure, you should. Then he continues along and he sees a fellow that the Gemara calls Yeshu. Now, Yeshu is generally known as the name of Jesus. So he sees him, he says, what are you up to nowadays? He says, I'm suffering. He says, oh no. He says, what are you suffering in? And the way that it reads it, he says, most of the disputation was actually in Latin. At this point, they turned to French because everybody in the crowd would understand it. And he says, he's suffering in piles of excrement. And he says, should I convert to Judaism? He says, definitely. So they attack. He says, how dare the Talmud say that about Jesus? So there's two answers. There's the answer he gave, and there's the answer that comes up a little bit later in the 1260s. The answer that he gives is, he says, guess what? When you look throughout the Talmud, and it's a beautiful line, he says, when you look throughout the Talmud, there are several people named Yeshu. Yeshu was a pretty common name at the time, and he says, not every Louis in France is the king. Relax. There's a lot of people named Louis, but not everybody's king. Not every Yeshu mentioned in the Talmud is your Jesus. There are many Jesus throughout the Talmud, and some of them don't even work out in timeline, because we know that the famous Yeshu discussed in the Talmud was a student of a great sage named Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia. Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia was 150 years before the timeline of Jesus even starts. So how do you settle that? Now, that was his response. Whether he actually believed it or he was saying that to get out of this question, I don't know. I have to ask him next time I see him. But in about the 1260s in Spain, Nachmanides has a debate. Over there, they're debating less over the authenticity of the Talmud, more about interpretation of the Talmud and whether Jesus is the real Messiah or not. And this comes up in their debate. And whether the New Testament is true or not. And over there, he uses this idea to his advantage. And he says, nonetheless, in Judaism, the simple perspective was that he was a person who left the ways of Judaism. There's nothing more, there's nothing less about it. It's that simple. And that's all he says. And I don't think anything more than that needs to be said for now, although we can dedicate a class to that another time, the real perspective of Jesus from Judaism, at least according to the Talmudic tradition. Okay, the third category. Any questions before we move on? Okay, third category. Third category is how we treat the nations of the world. And before we even start this, I just want to put this out there. The term goy, that some people might think is offensive, is 100% not offensive. The Torah itself, the Bible itself, uses the term goy. What does it mean in the Bible? A nation. The Jewish people at times are referred to as a goy, a nation. Then other nations of the world at times are referred to as goy, a nation. There's absolutely nothing derogative about it. But as a Jew, you're a Jew, and then there are the other nations of the world. It's very simple. If somebody else wants to come up with a name how they want to identify, we will gladly go by that. You want to call yourself an Australian, we'll call you an Australian, an American. Whatever it is that you want, we're going to follow with that. But there's absolutely nothing derogative about the term goy in any way, shape, or form. I just want to put that out there. That's number one. Number two, 99% of the time, the Talmud doesn't even, many of these quotes and attacks in the Talmud doesn't even refer to it as a goy, as they'll write it, and you'll see what I mean about that in a moment. Talk about that later. All right. So we have this in source number 3. This is a quote that you will see many times. Toiv sheba'oivdei avodah zara haroig, which means people will quote this as the best of the goyim should be killed. It doesn't say that. It says the best of the heathens kill. Nah. How do you handle that? What are you going to do about that? Guess what? Look in source number 4, and I'm going to put that same line back into context. And the context is as follows. We read, right, we're coming up to the holiday of Passover. 7 days after the Jewish people leave Egypt, they're stuck at the sea. Pharaoh and his army come chasing the Jews. The sea splits, the Jewish people cross through, and the Egyptians drown in the sea. So the Medrash asks, 1 second, where did all of these animals come from? Didn't they die during the plagues? Remember how during the 10 plagues, there was 2 plagues particularly that attacked the animals. One was the pestilence and the other one was the hail. So all of the animals should have been dead. Where did they get the animals from? So by the way, if you look back in the portion in the Bible before that, it says that the God-fearing Egyptians listened to Moses and they brought their animals inside the house. And any God-fearing Egyptian who listened to Moses, their animals are spared. Which means, who gave up their animals to go chase down the Jewish people to murder them in the desert? It was the God-fearing Egyptians. So from that, the Medrash makes a statement. He says, by the way, it's not talking what you should do, it's taking something very practical. Who was killed at the sea? The God-fearing Egyptians, or really the idolatrous ones, but the heathens. But anyways, in other words, that even the good ones were killed. What does that mean, even the good ones are killed? Because even the good ones got on their horses to chase down, to try to murder the Jews. So what's the big deal with that? Number one. Number two, look in source number 5. Where is this statement coming from? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. What does he say? At the time of war, yeah, you kill even the good ones. What does that mean? At a time of war, when someone's holding a gun against you, if they're on the other side, you shoot. You say, but one second, what if they're good and God-fearing? He said, that's very nice, but if they're going to shoot you, you shoot. Don't sit there and going, oh yeah, but they're good people. But if they're going to shoot you, you shoot them. It's a very simple law of physics, of war, of nature. You call it whatever you want. 1 + 1 = 2. They're going to shoot, you shoot. How good or how bad they are is irrelevant. It's a time of war. And that's exactly what the statement is being made. So once again, you take it out of context, you can get excited about it, but it means absolutely nothing. Okay, the next one, number 6. Another common attack, polemic, rhetoric you'll see is that the Jewish people think that the non-Jews are less than human, subhuman, right? They try to do to us what Hitler and the Nazis in Machshamam did to us. They say that we dehumanize them, right? That I think the only people in history who are guilty of that were the antisemites who attacked the Jews, of dehumanizing us first. But anyways. So what do? They pull out this Gemara from Tractate Yevamot in source number 6, and it says that, again, read just the bold. The grave of Gentiles do not render impure through a tent, as it is stated, and you, my sheep, the sheep of my pasture, are men. Quote from Ezekiel. You, the Jewish people, are called men, but Gentiles are not called men because they are subhuman. That's how they read it. But I ask you, read this in context. What are we talking about over here? It has nothing to do with human or subhuman. It's purely a play on the verse. And that is, the verse that we have in Numbers that talks about ritual impurity uses the term when a man dies in a tent. Who is this man? So we say specifically that man refers to the Jewish people as opposed to non-Jews. Not that non-Jewish people are subhuman. Now, this piece of Talmud is, familiar with controversy besides the fact that he's attacked. And this goes back to 1911. 1911 was probably the last official Pesach-related blood libel. Now, let me tell you a little story. From the early 13th century and throughout until 1913, every couple of years or so, there'd be a group of Christians who come along and claim, and what they would do is they'd murder one of their own and claim that the Jewish people are murdering Christian children to put their blood in the matzah that they eat on Pesach. Now, this couldn't get more ridiculous. There's more than 8 times in the Torah that the Torah commands us not to eat blood. There is no source, no origin, no foundation for this idea, but from the early 13th century all the way through to the early 20th century, thousands upon thousands of Jews were murdered, houses were smashed, communities were destroyed, all in the name of what? Jewish people putting Christian blood in their matzahs. Nowadays, they use a different blood libel, but we're not going to go there. So what happens in 1911? There's a Jew, his name is Menachem Mendel Beilis, he's living in Kiev, Ukraine. He owns a brick factory. He's a very prominent, successful man in the community, both amongst the Jews and non-Jews. There is a group of gangsters who beat up a Christian boy and killed him, non-Jewish gangsters. And they decided that they're going to dump him in the brick factory that belonged to Menachem Mendel Beilis, and he would get arrested. So in 1911, the Tsar arrests Menachem Mendel Beilis. He's sitting in prison for 2 years. It finally comes to the date of the court trial, is on Yom Kippur, 1913. In Kippur 1913, the court date starts, and it lasts for about 5 or 6 weeks. At the end, thank God, he is acquitted, not guilty. However, during this court case, they're trying to prove, right, because there's arguments back and forth based on Talmud, based on the Bible, whether Jews do this type of stuff or not. So the prosecutor brings up this Talmud and says, you see, even the Jews believe that non-Jews are subhuman, so of course it's okay to kill a Christian child because you don't believe that they're human anyways. Look at this statement. You, the Jewish people, are called man, human beings, Adam, not the non-Jews, right? So they didn't buy the first interpretation which I gave you, not because they didn't buy it, because they didn't believe it, because they didn't want to believe it, but that's another story. So there was a great sage in the crowd, I forget his name right now, I think it was Rabbi Aronson or something. And he comes up with a phenomenal interpretation, and it's true. He says, if you look at the terminology, it says atem. Now, anybody who knows Hebrew, atem is plural, right? So you, plural, kruyim are called Adam. Adam is singular. For many people, you don't call a group of people person, you'd say persons. Adam is one person, a human being. So why is it that we're going from you, plural, to all of a sudden singular? That doesn't make sense. And he says, as follows. He says, since 1911, since the arrest of Menachem Mendel Beilis, around the world, not just in Kiev, but every country in the world where the Jewish people reside, and they've heard about this case, since 1911, they've shown their love, support, and their care to Menachem Mendel Beilis. Jews in Israel, Jews in America, when they wake up in the morning, they go running for the newspaper. What happened with Menachem Mendel Beilis? He says, this town where this boy was murdered, where he comes from, they've already forgotten about him. They moved on with life. The only people who care anymore are you, the prosecutors, and the antisemites. The community itself could care less. Forget about the rest of the community in Kiev, the rest of the community across Ukraine, Russia, and that region. They're not blinking twice about it. But you, plural, the Jewish people are one. The nations of the world are not called one. And that's it. So, Atem Kriyim Adam, which means you, the Jewish body, is called Adam, one person, versus the nations of the world are known as Bnei Adam. And if you don't believe me, look it up in the Bible. The prophet refers to the nations of the world as Bnei Adam, which means children of man. That they are human beings, but they're spread out. They don't care for each other as much as the Jewish family does. And that's why you have Jews across the world who care for a Jew they never met before. Why? Because he's a brother, a sister. He says, but in this case, and he made this point in court, and they had nothing to respond to that. Okay, let's move along. We have in source number 7, and this is from a passage in the Talmud Avodah Zarah. One of my favorite. Shalu lehechan hoylech. If a heathen asks a Jew, where are you going? Right, before we say this one, I'll tell you the joke, right? The guy comes to the airport, he's checking into Spirit Airlines. He's got 2 suitcases. He says, excuse me, can you get the red suitcase to St. Louis? Can you get the black suitcase to Fort Lauderdale and me to New York? The guy behind the counter says, absolutely not. Your tickets to New York, your suitcases are going with you. He says, are you sure you can't do it? He says, yes, positive, we can't do it. We're not a luggage carrier service. He says, good, because last time you did it, I don't want it happening again. So the Gemara says, right, the heathen asks you, the Gentile asks you, he says, where are you going? Yachiv le'aderech. Don't tell him where you're going, extend your journey. Which means, right, somebody asks you, right, let's say you're traveling from here to, I don't know, Sheboygan. And then Andrew asks, he says, where are you going? Say, Green Bay. Right, we're going to Green Bay, Door County. Why? Because we see Jacob did that to Esav. Why? Because after the great showdown where they didn't see each other for 22 years, they meet up again. And what happens? Esav says, why don't you come with me to Seir? So the Chesiv, Yaakov says, he says, don't worry, I'm coming to Seir. He says, I'm going to come with you, but let me go travel myself because I'm with family and little kids, so it takes us a lot longer. You guys go faster. But I'm coming to Seir. Jacob never made it to Seir. He wasn't planning on going there. He was planning on stopping in Israel, and that was it. So 1 second. So what do we learn from there? You should deceive the guy, deceive the non-Jew. Is that what it means? 2 interpretations. Interpretation number 1 is, who are we talking about? Esav wanted to murder Jacob. So Yaakov says, I'm not going to let him trap me along the road. I'm going to tell him I'm coming to Seir. He'll set the trap much further than I'm planning on going. I'm going to stop in Israel. Everything's going to be fine. By the time he sets up his trap, he's going to realize I'm not coming. We're talking about heathens who back in the day were ready to murder a Jew at this first opportunity that they had. So you meet such a person on the road, you don't tell them where they're going. It's like you go on social media nowadays, you want to know how to be safe when you're traveling. That's exactly what they'll tell you. You're a woman alone at a bar traveling in Europe, you don't ever tell anybody where you're staying. You tell them somewhere else. Why? Your life's in danger. Guess what? For the Jewish people, most of our history when we were living in these other lands, that was our reality. So what's the Talmud giving you? Good advice. That's number 1. Number 2, Right? So they should read this and question themselves. But anyways, number two, actually Jacob was making a prediction. He wasn't lying. He says, I'm coming down to Seir, not today, but as it says in the prophet Ovadia, who was a convert from Rome, which means that when Mashiach will come, we will gather in Seir, the portion of land that belongs to Esav, and Esav will be judged for all of the torment and all the horrible things that they did to the Jewish people throughout history. He was not lying. Yaakov was just talking a couple of years later. Yaakov had foresight. He didn't. Anyways, okay, number 8. And how do I know that you're not allowed to deceive a non-Jew? A regular non-Jew who's not out to kill you, that is. Right? Again, as long as we're not dealing with a serial murderer or rapist, how do you treat them? So look in source number 8. The Talmud there is discussing about if you send a non-Jew, you're not allowed to send a non-Jew cut up meat. Why can't you send him cut up meat? So the Talmud says because when you send him cut up meat, he's going to get it as a gift. He's going to think you sent him kosher meat. Meanwhile, all it is non-kosher meat cut up. But because you cut it up, he's going to think that you traded it according to Jewish law, and he's going to feel very good about himself. Why? Because you went through the trouble to give him a gift of kosher meat. And you're not allowed to, the Gemara says, you deceived him. You sent him non-kosher meat. He gets it, he thinks it's kosher meat. And that itself is already deception, and that's forbidden. You see how careful we have to be with even deceiving a non-Jew? Balance one piece of Talmud with the other, and you get a different picture. And we see the same idea. Let's look in source number 9. Source number 9 is talking about tax evasion. Right? So the Jewish stereotype, this is where it comes from. Joking, it's not. There is no stereotype. All right. Talk to my accountant later. Says the Talmud as follows. The Talmud says you are allowed to evade the tax collector. But what's the scenario? It says one may vow before murderers, plunderers, and custom collectors that what you are carrying is either truma, which means it belongs to the temple, or it belongs to the king. You can swear falsely so that they don't take it from you. So the Talmud asks, 1 second, but the law of the kingdom is the law, which in general is a very fundamental idea in Judaism, that the law of the land in which we live, we must follow. There's no such thing as getting away with that law just because the Torah doesn't say it. If that's the law of the land, that's the law you follow. The Talmud says, gives 2 options. And number 1, it's a tax without limitation, which means it's a tax that's unfairly being taxed from the Jewish community as opposed to any other community. In that case, there's no problem to evade because that's just antisemitism, and you're allowed to evade antisemitism. And the second is, we're talking about a rogue tax collector who will kill you if you don't give them all your money. Yeah, that's the tax collector, the IRS agent who's trying to twist your arm to get a couple of bucks. When your phone rings and there's an automated teller, this is the IRS. If you don't pay us $1 million now, you're going to lose all your money, right? Then everybody starts giving out credit card numbers and social security details. Don't do it. It's not the IRS. Anyways, but we find once again the same idea. Yeah, who are we evading? We're evading the non-Jew that's ready to murder the Jew just for being a Jew, just for being successful. That person you're allowed to evade. If they're not that type of person we just saw before, you're not allowed to even deceive them that they think you gave them a better gift than you actually gave them. And there are many more examples, but due to time, we're not going to go into them. But I'll give you one more idea before we go on to the next subject, and that's the 4th one, and that is the night of the Seder. After we finish our 3rd cup of wine, after we bench and we praise God for the food that we ate, we're going to read a chapter. And everybody says, which means it's a chapter from Psalm 69. We say to God, pour your wrath. I think it's 69. Is it 69, 70? You pour your wrath on the nations of the world. Look at these Jews. Look what they're praying to God. Destroy the nations of the world. My friend. No. You've read 2 words of an entire sentence. It says, pour your wrath on the nations of the world which do not know you and do not call your name. What does that mean? Yeah, God, get rid of the evil of the world. And if anybody is not willing to get up and say, God, get rid of the evil in the world, you might be evil. Shh, don't tell anybody. It's a very simple idea. But anyways, I'll let you use that for your Seder. Okay, the next one. This is number 4. And this is known as Agadat Gemara. Agadat Gemara is when you'll be reading some ideas about laws, this, that, back and forth, and all of a sudden the Gemara will show up with some kind of random or crazy story. And you read it and you're not sure what to do with yourself. You're not sure if this came from Hollywood or this came from Universal. But it's got to have, right? Is Disney or Universal, what's going on over here? Where did they come up with this? First of all, a lot of the ideas actually do come from the Talmud, and a lot of these creatures and these fascinating ideas. Do yourself a favor, there's a book called Creatures of the Talmud. It's fascinating. It's just a compilation of a lot of these ideas. But anyways, so they took issue back at the court that the Talmud comes up with these nonsense ideas. Now, the funny thing is the example that they chose is not very hard to defend, but it's an example that they chose, so we're going to go with that. But again, there are hundreds of such cases. And that is, it discusses about how when the Jewish people are circling the border of Israel in the last year in the desert, the 40th year, and that is when Moses is waging war against some of the nations that already attacked the Jews. There's a king, his name is Og, he's the king of Bashan. He comes out and he's this giant of a dude. A lot taller than 30 feet tall. And he lifts up a mountain. Let's read it there in source number 10. Lifts up a mountain. He's ready to smash the Jewish people with it. And this mountain is like 3 miles long, 3 miles high. And the grasshoppers in the mountain start eating away because he's holding it on his head. He's balancing it because it's a little bit heavy. And right above his head, it gets weak. And it crumbles. It falls on his head. His teeth grow like a walrus. He can't get it off. And it's at that moment that Moses, who was about 20 feet tall, jumps up and swings. So between he's 20 feet tall. He's got like a 20-foot vertical. Who knows how tall, right? At the combine, he would have done really good. Anyway, he's got a long, long stick, and he smashes Og's ankle. That's how tall Og was, all right? And Og comes toppling down, and he falls this giant. They say, come on, this can't be real. This stuff's made up. You guys really believe this? This is the claim of the Christians, okay? So, number one, he's going to respond. But what's funny about this is, I don't know why he didn't just respond by going, you guys believe in nonsensical stuff too, so what's the problem? Like, let's agree to disagree. You'll believe in your nonsense, we'll believe in our nonsense, let's move on. That's not what he responds. Response number one, it's an exaggeration. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's almost like, you say like, oh, I saw that building, that thing was up to the heavens, right? No, it was just a really tall building. Right? That plate was huge. It was like monumental. No, it wasn't really monumental. No, it was just really cool. Right? So like we do that all the time. So the sages are also allowed to get away with that, and he gave some examples. That's number one. Number two, he says to them, he says, come on, you guys believe in the Bible, right? You guys read the story in the Bible about the 10 plagues? You believe that? So why can't this be true? So what's the difference between one and the other? And then there's a third approach to a lot of these stories, and that is a lot of them are allegories, teaching us different insights and truths about life, but in a way of analogy, in a way that's a little bit more exciting, in a way where it actually hides the concept to those who are willing to look for it. Okay. Now, that concludes the conversation that they had, the disputation that they had. Unfortunately, I guess they felt it wasn't enough, and they went ahead and they burnt it. And throughout history, these ideas and these arguments have come up time and time and time again. But I feel like now, I hope, we're all a little bit more educated, have the tools to be able to at least pause the next time we hear it or see it, and maybe even to get into a healthy conversation and to answer and to educate others about it. But just to conclude on a positive note, and let's take a look at some good guidance from the Talmud that maybe before anybody attacks and takes the negative stuff, say maybe why don't you keep the good stuff first and then you'll get to the negative stuff. There's a great video that came out a couple of weeks ago of this guy in New York. There's this Jewish guy, Hasidic garb, right? So he's got the long coat, he's got the tzitzis on top, he's got the long side locks, and he's walking down the street, and this black fellow comes up to him and he says, "You're not the real Jews, we're the real Jews." So like everyone's like, what's he gonna do, right? So he turns to him and says, "Okay, so start keeping the Bible. What do you want from me? Like, you want to come and attack me? So start keeping the Bible, and we'll have a conversation. What do you want from me? I shouldn't keep the Bible? What exactly do you want? You want to start? Here's a Bible, and go educate yourself, So what is some of the good stuff? So we have it from source number 11. Rabbi Yochanan says as follows. Rabbi Yochanan was, the way that the Talmud praises him, was that he never walked by somebody without giving them a greeting before they greeted him, even a non-Jew in the marketplace. When's the last time you walked by somebody in Metro and they said nothing to you? When's the last time you walked down the hall of your own synagogue and somebody walked by you and said nothing to you? Says the Talmud, absolutely not. Be a good decent human being means you say good morning, good afternoon, hello to everybody you meet before they even say something to you. Try that before you attack. Another one. Yeah, not in New York. In New York, you get punched in the face, you do that, but people look at you weird. The East Coast, forget about it. Say, what's wrong with you? Why do you keep saying hi to people? Are you looking to mug someone? All right, number 12. Talmud Yerushalmi, Jerusalem Talmud says this as follows. Why was Adam created as singulars? We know that Adam and Eve were originally created as one being and then split into two. All the other animals were created in pairs, in twos. Why is it that the human being was created as one? The Talmud says to teach us that every life matters. That every single life is the world. Imagine if the first human being would have died before procreating, none of us would be here. And the Talmud says the reason why the Torah did that is to tell us that every single human being, man, woman, and child, is the most important human being in the world. Because without them, there wouldn't be a world. And that means Jew and non-Jew alike. No differentiation there. Number 13. This one's an important one. And that is, Amar Rav says, a person must always be careful about mistreatment of his wife. Going back to the Talmud contract, by the way, did you know that until the late 1800s, there was no code protecting a woman who was married from being raped by her other half? In Judaism, that's something which has already been in the contract from over 2,000 years ago, go figure. But anyways, but another note on that, the Talmud says that when it comes to how you live life, it says live life within your means, which means you eat food according to your means, which means what you can afford. Don't go splurging on food that you can't pay for. You treat yourself under your means. The way you dress, the car you drive should be under what you can afford. But the way that you treat your wife and children should be beyond your means. And we'll conclude with this one. This is the Talmud in Tainus, and says as follows. Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Shimon, entered the study hall and taught. A person should always be soft like a reed, and he should not be stiff like a cedar. Which means be kind, flexible, and humble. Don't be arrogant, inflexible, and just full of yourself. Learn how to get along with people. Learn how to be a nice person even when you don't want to be. You take these lessons, we work on those before we can even need to address the other ones, but as you can see, there's so much beauty and richness to what we have. So what do we do here tonight? One is, I want to encourage everybody to learn a little bit more about your own heritage, learn a little bit more about the teachings and wisdoms that we have as a heritage from our ancestors for the past 1,500 years, 2,000 years, 3,500 years. And there's so much to study, there's so much to learn, so I want to encourage everybody to continue. Another idea is I just want to do a quick plug, if I can have your attention here. We have a course coming up in May. I highly encourage everybody to join. And last but not least, Pesach is coming. So make sure you have all your preparations. If you need any help with matzah, if you need a seder to join, and do the Jewish nation a favor. Reach out to somebody who might not have matzah, might not have a seder. Either get them matzah, let us know, we'll get them matzah. Invite them to your seder, or they're more than welcome to join our seder. There are invitations on all the tables. I want to wish everybody a happy and kosher Pesach, and thank you for joining tonight. If anybody has any questions or the likes and comments, I'll be around for a few minutes. Let me just turn off the recording.